Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor for shadowproof.com, and welcome to this week's Dissenter Weekly. It's October 15th. Before we get rolling on our whistleblower stories for this week, Brian has a few things for you.
Hello, everybody. Brian here. Happy to be with you all again. And that you are subscribing on YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, as always, just to make sure that you keep up with us. And if you appreciate Kevin's reporting, which I know many of you do, please consider signing up for his newsletter, dissenter.substack.com, or going to shadowproof.com/donate. Either way, we will be supporting Kevin and his work and the other journalists that we have at Shadowproof. And with that, I think we should dive right in. We've got some good stories today, and we're starting off with one that I think has been sort of leading the news over the last at least 24 hours, I guess, maybe a little bit more than that. We have that Twitter has invoked an anti-WikiLeaks policy to censor the Hunter Biden story. What do you have for us here, Kevin?
Yeah, first, I just want to preface, I'm not going to be getting into the content of what New York Post published. I'm not here to fact check what is in it. I'm not going to say whether it's accurate or inaccurate. The reason why this is leading our show is because Twitter, along with Facebook, although Facebook took a different tactic in censoring the spread of the story that was published by the New York Post, Twitter has invoked a policy that was adopted in 2018 for the publication of hacked materials and its distribution. And so just to be clear here, the policy that they laid out in October of 2018 is this. Our rules prohibit the distribution of hacked material that contains private information or trade secrets or could put people in harm's way. We are also expanding the criteria for when we will take action on accounts which claim responsibility for a hack, which includes threats and public incentives to hack specific people and accounts. Commentary about a hack or hacked materials, such as news articles discussing a hack, are generally not considered a violation of this policy. Now, so, as it says here in their policy, they seem to specifically want to prevent private information from being compromised. I think that if you were to ask the executives at Twitter, they would say that they were protecting the personal photographs of Hunter Biden from dissemination, and that was part of what they were doing, because there were photographs that aren't really in the public interest that were shared by the New York Post as part of the way they salaciously covered this story. But we know that the right wing has crafted this narrative, and honestly, almost a identical manner to the way that Democrats constructed a narrative around the Trump administration with the Russiagate conspiracy allegations. They've constructed their own narrative around what Hunter Biden and his family have done to use their power and influence and gain position. And of course, this has involved Burisma. And so you have this story that comes out, and it says that it came from a laptop that was brought to a computer shop owner, and the laptop had apparently was dropped off by Hunter Biden. The owner can't really say for certain whether it was Hunter Biden or not, but it had Hunter Biden's accounts. They were able to pull off this material that certainly seems like it comes from Hunter Biden. And so then at some point, the FBI was contacted by this computer shop owner. At some point, the attorney for Rudy Giuliani gets involved. And then as far as we can tell from the timeline, the New York Post got their hands on these emails. And I'm certainly fine if we want to accept that this is all being done as a kind of right-wing information operation in order to boost Donald Trump's chances at a moment when he really needs some kind of support, because he's being blown away in a lot of the polls that we've seen thus far over the past couple of weeks. I'm fine with accepting that. The issue that I have is that Twitter is invoking this policy that was advocated by Senator Tom Cotton back in September of 2018. And I wrote this down. I have this. Unfortunately, we're not able to play the clip, but he said, one set of accounts that remain on your platforms on WikiLeaks are WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. This was during a hearing with the executives for Facebook, Jack Dorsey, and was there for Twitter, and then Sheryl Sandberg for Facebook. He mentioned Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, when he was the director of the CIA, characterized WikiLeaks as a non-state hostile intelligence service. This committee has agreed with that assessment now for a couple of years. Yet WikiLeaks, which propagated some of the leaked emails in the 2016 election from the Democrats, remain active on both Facebook and Twitter, as does Julian Assange. And this was before he was indicted and arrested. So then he asked, can you explain why Facebook continues to allow these accounts to be active? And the same question was put to Dorsey, Jack Dorsey. And he said, we've not found any violations of our terms of service, but we are open as always to any law enforcement insight that would indicate a violation of our terms. And then about a month later, there was a policy that was announced, and it quite clearly targets any account that would be announcing that they have a leak, that they obtained materials from a leak that could be sensitive or private information from individuals, those working on private election campaigns, and especially if they're non-government agency emails. And whether or not they might be in the public interest, it doesn't matter. Twitter is going to intervene to censor the spread of this information. And what you see is that I think we have made a huge mistake collectively. I am adamantly opposed to the way this was dealt with, because what you have now in the last 24 hours is that because there is a animosity towards WikiLeaks, because there's a belief that WikiLeaks is responsible for Donald Trump's, or partly responsible for Donald Trump's election, and there's they fit into this Russiagate conspiracy, that they were part of the effort to hand Donald Trump the election and defeat Hillary Clinton. Because you have this residual fear, and you see that there are liberals and many media outlets that crave and want this kind of action from Twitter and Facebook to clamp down on this story. And to wrap up on my point, what I'll say is, this isn't just me trying to echo conservative talking points. I'm not just trying to be part of some right-wing media echo chamber. I think independently of that, and from a progressive standpoint or the left, we really should be saying this is not how you deal with information that is media malpractice, or perhaps a part of right-wing propaganda. So far as I can tell, the proof has not been connected. We have not seen a very specific outline created that Russian intelligence or anybody in Russia was responsible, even if Giuliani has been having meetings with individuals. We just don't know. There wasn't any time for us to figure out where this story actually fits into what kind of agenda the right might have with Donald Trump. But assuming the worst motives, if you don't want people to read it, the last thing you should do is be censoring it in this manner. New York Post people were locked out of their own professional accounts for at least 12, if not close to 36 hours. They were almost all of the afternoon on Wednesday and into the evening. They were not able to access their account. You were not allowed to, as I couldn't, nobody could send a direct message linking to this story. If you wanted to expose it and describe how it was propaganda, or it's baseless, it was not possible to reference the story and share it. You couldn't take screenshots of it and share it. You couldn't talk about this if you were certain individuals, because Twitter was monitoring your accounts and censoring the spread. And, I've seen it suggested. I think it's Liz Franczak. She's on Twitter, And, she said, basically, nobody has talked about how in the last 4 years, Facebook and Twitter have become essentially rapid response operations for the Democratic Party. And that's what we saw in the last 24 hours. Instead of Joe Biden's campaign being responsible for going through all of the damage control that typically political campaigns would have to go through if a story like this broke, instead of them having to deal with convincing us why it's false, salacious, defamatory, maybe why the people involved should be sued, instead of them having to defend themselves, as we've seen throughout political history, they said, nope, this could be the end of Biden's chances if we don't censor this material. And so we are not going to allow this October surprise to happen. So everyone was deprived a chance to make their own informed decision as citizens. And now what it's done is it's brought millions of more eyeballs to the story than there ever would have been on it. And it's brought more intrigue to it. And it's created more debate around this. And, in fact, we're leading our show with it. Had this not happened, I would have totally ignored this story about emails on a laptop that may or may not have belonged to Hunter Biden. We do not know. It has not been proven. So I think it's important to say that, it's hacked material in the sense that computer shop owner should not have been in the computer. But, to the extent that it's emails that are of any public interest, the fact that this laptop apparently was never retrieved was kind of, I have a huge question in my head of, why isn't anybody coming back for this computer? And then later on, if the computer shop owner in the middle of election wants to turn it over to a journalist and say, hey, I have this computer, it's got questionable material. I think it might be in the public interest. It relates to this election. I have to say that I don't really have a professional reluctance to look through that material and see if there's something. I wouldn't have published the pictures of Hunter Biden smoking crack and sitting in his tub. I don't see any public benefit of that other than just, slandering his reputation and making him look sleazy. Although you don't really have to do that. He kind of does that on his own. If it's talking about the kinds of positions he was able to obtain because Joe Biden was vice president, that is in the public interest.
Thank you, Kevin. I think my reaction to what you're saying too is that I'm glad that you have been covering the WikiLeaks story the way that you have, because I think that we're really starting to see, sort of the way that the fruits of the government's campaign to use WikiLeaks as sort of this, like a proxy or like a totem for like a larger war on journalism. It's about WikiLeaks, and it's also not about WikiLeaks. It's more about, generally the government and powerful people in general protecting information from, release from the public. And especially when, like you said, like the Democratic Party in particular, but as you noted with Tom Cotton's comments at the beginning of your segment, the state is clearly deputizing, and to some extent doesn't even really need to, but implicitly deputizing these corporations that are providing services that are more or less public utilities at this point, as I guess law enforcement or moral enforcement or whatever have you. So I just think that this is a good example of, while it's still sort of like founded in WikiLeaks and the government's approach to WikiLeaks, that what is happening with WikiLeaks is just sort of the entry point to a larger attack on journalism and free speech. So I appreciate you bringing this story up.
And there's one more point that needs to be made, which I think you'd appreciate. So earlier this year, we had the Blue Leaks, and I won't go into a lot of detail about it, but those were hacked materials that exposed law enforcement. And because there were sensitive details and some of it was private information, I think including addresses and stuff of that nature, it was entirely shut down. Even if it had some kind of public interest value, that cache of information was something that Twitter took upon itself to censor. And so I think that raises that we need to have an open discussion, a responsible and mature, politically mature discussion about what we're talking about here, because the power that law enforcement might have to shut down leaks that expose them, if they can just say, oh, well, my home address is in there, I could be under threat, shut it down, then maybe we would see that, a cache of information exposing police misconduct, like the names of officers who are habitually committing crimes against individuals and communities. Well, I mean, maybe they could say, let's just suppress those records by going, oh, my address is on that document, don't release it. So it's very easy for the way that Twitter has set up this policy to go after anyone selectively. I mean, we have to understand this is not going to be an evenly applied policy. They're going to do it based upon the people who are easiest to suppress and people who have positions of power who can convince them that the policy should not be applied, perhaps like the New York Times, don't have to go through that. I've seen people raise the question of, what if the tax returns from Donald Trump came from a hack? And what if we've all been sharing information? Also, what if someone had a copy of Donald Trump's actual tax returns and we were sharing those and those were from a hack? Would Twitter shut that down? Would Twitter shut that down? And I think that's like a really important question for us to grapple with, because I think, to me, it just seems like the logical answer here in almost every scenario, unless somebody is endangered, is that we should have journalism that picks apart this kind of media malpractice, that shows people why it's fraudulent. You've got CNN and you have MSNBC, 24/7 cable news networks that could have spent all day yesterday picking apart why this story was false, why it was part of some right-wing propaganda operation. Let people learn from people who are professionals at digging into this stuff. But instead, it was, no, we can't even trust people to read this. We can't even allow them to make a decision. We're going to have Twitter and Facebook, and we're going to encourage Twitter and Facebook to shut down what we think is a disinformation operation.
Thank you, Kevin. I think we should move on to our next story here. We have a whistleblower who was hired to screen workers for COVID-19 exposes a meatpacking corporation's oppressive conduct. What is this story?
Yeah, so this was the story I sent out, the free story I sent to everyone who's a subscriber to the Dissenter. And it focused on this meatpacking plant that I think flies under the radar. A lot of people will look at Tyson and recognize them as a meat producer, someone that packages and ships it around to all of the stores throughout the United States. But JBS is actually a very large meat packing operation that has plants throughout the United States. And their corporation is based in Brazil. And I took a moment to look at their record of corruption and then connect that to the workplace oppression that is happening in plants throughout the United States. So for one, just as some context, in 2017, they were forced to pay $3.2 billion after admitting to bribing over 1,000 politicians in Brazil. So this is the kind of corporation that they are. It was documented from this investigation in Brazil called Operation Weak Flesh that what they were doing was inappropriate, and the importation of Brazilian beef was banned in the European Union as well as the United States. But this year, in February, the Trump administration cleared the way for those imports to resume again. So this was just before everything shut down around the pandemic. And now you've got workers throughout the United States that are at these plants, primarily immigrants who don't speak English, who are going into these very harsh conditions. And we learned from this whistleblower, her name is Sarah Jean Buck, and there was another whistleblower as well, but I mostly focused on her, who was hired to do screening for JBS through I think a temp worker firm. And she was hired to go there and use a thermal scanner as well as other temperature taking mechanism. And that way she could figure out if anyone had symptoms of COVID-19 and should be sent home. But constantly the tools she had were malfunctioning. In fact, we learned that the tent where she was set up outside the plant to work is very rickety, and it's dirty and filthy, and a metal pole. It's basically just a tarp with metal poles. It's not even a tent. It's not very controlled. You can't socially distance in it. And the signs that are there for people to follow are in English. And again, as I said, many of them are non-English speakers. And so she would try to work around this as people complained to her or said that or showed symptoms. She had the ability to offer them a COVID-19 test, but at some point while she was there over 2 months, this is back in like May or June, at some point, JBS decided that they're no longer going to cover COVID-19 tests. And so now it was up to them. If they wanted to get a test, they would have to pay $100 to get the test, or they'd have to have health insurance that would cover it. And as she says, JBS would try to convince people they were fine to go to work. For example, if someone came through screening and reported having a cough, the head of health services would ask if they slept with their window open. If the employee said yes, then the head of health services would say that was causing the cough, and they were fine to go to work. Or they would put it on her to explain to employees that they had to pay for that test, and if they were not feeling well, and then if they changed their mind once they heard they would need to pay, so basically she says that they would be told that they had to pay for the tests, and then the employees would invariably say something like, well, just my sinus is acting up. It's probably nothing significant. And she says that the management was telling her that these employees should be threatened with no pay. I even had one guy one time try to tell me he was sick, and I called for an interpreter, and they said, no, just send him to work. We don't have time to interpret right now. So it sounds horrible. There have been 6 people who have died in this plant, at least, that we know of, that can be connected to COVID-19. For 2 weeks, this plant shut down. And afterwards, they adopted, on the recommendation of the Colorado Health Department, so I'm talking about a plant in Greeley, Colorado, they adopted this policy of screening people, although it's just, checking the boxes, dotting I's, crossing T's, doing the bare minimum, and not really caring at all about the well-being of the workers. And then now we've got Sarah Jean, who stepped forward after quitting her temporary work, not a regular employee at the plant, not someone even going inside the plant, but somebody outside who was able to blow the whistle and show us the way in which they're manipulating this process. So I can go to the next story because it's connected. And I wanted to dig into, so this is connected to the whistleblower retaliation complaints, because what we're describing here is something that that OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, should be dealing with. We're talking about complaints about the workplace and how people are being abused here. We've seen people linked to meatpacking plants have to go so far as to sue OSHA because they are not actually doing their job at enforcing workplace safety regulations in these kinds of plants, especially the ones that JBS is running. And so we learn from this analysis put out by the National Employment Law Project, and they've been doing some good work on behalf of workers during the pandemic. We learn that of the 1,744 COVID-19 related retaliation complaints, so workers file complaints saying they were retaliated because they raised concerns with the management. Out of those complaints, we find that only 1 in 5 were docketed for investigation. There were only 2% of complaints, so 35 of those, that were resolved during that period. But that doesn't mean necessarily that they produced the outcome that the worker wanted. It just means that those were completed and reviewed in their entirety. Most complaints, 54% of them, were dismissed or closed without any investigation. And I believe that if I could point to another colleague or someone in journalism who does really good work on this, David Sirota over at the Daily Poster, I believe he was saying that they've documented how these outbreaks at some of these workplaces can actually be matched up with certain areas throughout the country in states, so they could show that because those outbreaks weren't stopped among employees, that they then led to spikes in areas throughout the United States. So this is a huge problem, especially as we're seeing states report record cases throughout the United States. The fact that we do not have a government that will take care of workers is in effect spreading the virus, putting more people in danger, and resulting in deaths. And the worst part of all of this in the story, as I get to at the end, is that afterwards there are people with family members who have been who have died, who try to connect their death to getting COVID-19 in the facility and ask for workers' compensation benefits. The family makes these applications, and JBS has denied several of these applications and have gone overboard to try and claim that people who were in the factory must have got it from somewhere else, must have got it from going to church, must have got it with family. It couldn't possibly be in our plant. And so if anybody can't show that the only place that they were before they died, the only place that their family was before they died, if they can't prove that it was only in a plant or an office, we're seeing how corporations are saying, well, it couldn't possibly be us. It must be your family. It must be your church. It must be when you went to the post office or the grocery store. And it's not that they rule out their place, but because it's not 100% certain that you got it from the JBS meatpacking plant, JBS is able to be cruel to these families that are low wage, immigrant workers primarily. They're able to be cruel and deny them compensation.
Thank you, Kevin. Let's move to our next story here. We have the Department of Homeland Security is expanding its Insider Threat program and claims authority to disregard privacy law. What is this story?
Yeah. And I'll try to go through the next. We have two more stories. We're going a little longer. I'll try to go through these pretty quickly, just so that we can stay within the normal time. But this comes from NextGov, from Aaron Boyd, and this deals with the Insider Threat program that, as we started our show, and as you were making the point about the way institutions have responded to WikiLeaks and why it's important to be following Julian Assange's case, this Insider Threat program comes out of Chelsea Manning's disclosures to WikiLeaks, and we've seen it proliferated, and we're seeing the creep, the way it's going beyond what its initial purpose was and being used for total information control and for something called continuous monitoring, where you're constantly monitoring employees, even if you don't suspect them of leaks. It's for essentially total surveillance. And so here we see from this article that they are saying that as they expand this Insider Threat program to cover all DHS employees, past and present, so they can go after people who are no longer working for the agency anymore. They can collect data about those individuals. So they've now gone beyond, and we see in this story that this isn't just a Trump administration development, that it actually goes back to Homeland Security Secretary Jay Johnson, who agreed the program should be expanded. And we see several details in here, but what I'll get to is that they are specifically flouting the Privacy Act provisions that are as follows. And I think this is important. This is the kind of story that this show exists to cover because it goes ignored usually. So one provision of the Privacy Act that they're ignoring is one that prevents an agency or program from sharing data on an individual without that individual's consent. Another is the requirement to allow an individual to review and request amendments to data about their person. So to be able to know what that agency is creating a dossier on you about, to see that and to say, that's inaccurate or that is accurate. But they're not allowing employees to see the information being collected upon them. And again, this isn't even, there doesn't have to be an open investigation. Just you can become someone of interest to the DHS who's collecting data on these people. Informing a person that information is being collected and what that information is, that's a Privacy Act law or provision. Another provision is informing individuals in the public about data sharing or matching agreements with other organizations. So DHS doesn't have to tell employees that they're sharing the information they collect on you with other agencies in government. And then there's a provision of the Privacy Act that they're also ignoring that is supposed to prevent over-collection of data that is not relevant to a mission. So in this case, preventing disclosure of protected information. So there's all this material that they could be collecting on a person that has nothing to do with whether they're going to leak to the public or the media without authorization in the future. It has nothing to do with whether they might give information to a foreign power or a foreign intelligence agency for money, or whether they might be paid by a terrorist group and go work for that organization. None of that. So we're getting way beyond what law enforcement interest they might have to conduct this surveillance of employees. And so it's important for us to talk about this. It can chill whistleblower communications. There's been concerns raised in the past about how these insider threat programs are operated. We've seen a radical expansion in government over the last decade. And I'll just close on this story by saying there was a commenter who suggested that 3 ways that they could make this better would be to minimize the amount of data collected, because any of this information could be breached. We just talked about hacked materials when we started the show. And what if this is vulnerable to hacking, and what if it gets out and, I don't know, maybe it's going to be published somewhere on the internet, and it could be the fault of the US government, and then Twitter and Facebook will have to come in and censor, upset as they prevent us from seeing how the DHS is violating people's privacy. Another suggestion was that they could exclude collecting information on individuals and relevant personal associations, including those not under investigation by DHS. That seems reasonable. They could also prohibit the use of data for purposes other than intended at the time of collection. For example, if someone submits information about their health insurance eligibility, those could be excluded from these kinds of insider threat determinations, because it probably doesn't have any bearing on whether somebody will leak information. At least it shouldn't. Whether you have cancer or whether you're struggling with mental health issues, probably should not be penalized and not allowed to have access. That seems discriminatory. Well, ultimately, DHS said, thank you for this comment, but we will be making no changes. So there are multiple things they were told that they should do to protect employees' privacy, and they simply don't care. So the expansion of this total surveillance regime inside of the agency, as well as other agencies of government, continues unchecked.
Imagine that. Our last story here, we have Reporters Without Borders, details barriers to access at the Assange extradition trial. Why don't you tell us about this last story here?
Yeah, so first off, Reporters Without Borders has been a press freedom organization that has led the way in challenging the U.S. government's prosecution against Julian Assange. They've been very aggressive. They didn't just do the bare minimum. Their director for international campaigns, Rebecca Vincent, went above and beyond to try to be present at all of the days that the court was hearing argument during the extradition trial, but it was very difficult. And initially, they were led to believe that they would have access to the proceedings remotely. But on the first day, we learned that 40 observers were denied access to the trial, that they were blocked from being able to sign in to the cloud video platform that I was using in order to do journalism remotely without being in London during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so they complained, but as they point out, the thing that is really upsetting is that they had to rely on accessing the very few seats that were made available in the public gallery of an overflow courtroom for most sittings. They complained to UK government officials, and they weren't very concerned. And so I just want to read this one paragraph before concluding, because I think this is a detail that I didn't give a lot of attention in my reporting because I was focused on doing my work. But this gives you a sense of the lack of open justice at Assange's extradition trial. So because they were not given access to the platform, RSF writes, this meant that the only way for NGO observers to monitor proceedings was to gain access to one of the very few spots in the public gallery of the overflow courtroom, next to the courtroom where proceedings were taking place. RSF observers, that's Reporters Without Borders, could only view a small television screen from across a large room on which it was often not possible to see who was speaking or even whether the judge was sitting. It was not possible to clearly see Assange in the glass dock he was held in at the back of the courtroom, or assess his well-being, whether he could adequately follow proceedings, or if he could communicate easily with his legal representation, all of which were issues in the February proceedings. Due to the COVID distancing measures, the court had 5 spaces available to members of the public in a gallery of 36 seats. Communications from court repeatedly stated these would be allocated on a first-come, first-served basis. However, that was not respected. For 3 weeks of the proceedings, 3 seats were held back for unspecified, and they put this in quotes, VIPs for the first hour and a half each morning. The first half an hour each afternoon, meaning that often only 2 members of the public, that included observers from Reporters Without Borders, were present in the courtroom. After RSF learned that the VIPs were in fact diplomats who were unaware that these seats were being held for them, diplomatic intervention with the court finally resulted in all 5 seats being made available to the public from September 24th onward. So what the court did is they decided not to distinguish between the press and politicians and observers. And in effect, these people who should have had access to follow and observe the proceedings just as much as press, in my view, were denied the ability, even though it would have been very simple for the court to come up with a way to accommodate them. And they chose not to do so. And so Reporters Without Borders put together this. I won't go into the rest of the details because I believe we need to wrap. But at the end, on their site, if you want to see more, it's Julian Assange's extradition hearing, marred by barriers to open justice. We'll have a link in our post that shares this week's Dissenter Weekly. And so I don't really have anything else to add. We've gone longer than we typically would for the show. But again, if you're not a subscriber for the Dissenter newsletter, I encourage you to go there at dissenter.substack.com, dissenter.substack.com, and there you can receive both the free, and if you become a paid subscriber, you'll get anything exclusive we send out. I typically every week will try to do a free piece and then something just exclusive. And so thank you again for following, and thank you for tolerating the rant at the beginning of the show, which was not exactly what we typically would do. We normally peg it to a specific story, but I felt it was important to say something about this development because we talked about it before. We talked about it when YouTube was making the same claim that they would censor hacked materials if you talked about them in your show. And I questioned what could happen to this show if we were, what if I wanted to refer back to the Podesta emails in 2016 to make some kind of comment, to say something about anything related to 2020's election? Would I be in trouble? Would I be risking the ability of you to be able to tune into this show and to become subscribers? And I don't know. I think it's an open question. So that was why, we spent the first 15 minutes on this thing. So I don't think it's just a right-wing thing, and we shouldn't just let it be a right-wing thing. Don't let the right wing control the conversation on censorship of content. I think we should be involved as well. Progressives, people on the left, should be involved in the discussions and not let it just be monopolized by people at Breitbart and Fox News.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think especially as we're just a couple weeks from the election now, it's important to underscore, particularly for people who've been reporting through several administrations now, that the war on leaks is transpartisan, it's bipartisan. You should fully expect, regardless of your political positions, that a Biden administration will continue one way or another to crack down on leaks, I think. And I don't know, Kevin, maybe you would disagree based on any information that you have, but assuming that, a lot of the people from the previous administration are likely to inhabit this one, plus a lot of people who have jumped ship from the Republican Party over the last 4 years, I would say it's a pretty safe bet that we're going to see, sort of new developments on how the government, in tandem with these corporations, are going to crack down on journalism. So
no, I don't expect anything that much different from a Biden administration. We've had total silence from the Biden-Harris campaign during the extradition trial. We didn't even hear anything from Bernie Sanders or any of the other progressives. They've been completely held hostage by the 2020 election cycle and decided to not speak up and say anything at all while the extradition trial was unfolding. And I just want to remind people of I'm going to put it this way in a kind of inflammatory way, of the child porn rule, which is that law enforcement will often make claims about what needs to be done, what kind of power needs to be granted for surveillance, for controlling the spread of content, just by saying, things like, oh, we can't have pornography, or we can't have child pornography out there, or we can't allow sex predators, or we can't allow this, or people will be able to commit revenge porn, things like that. And those are all valid things for us to fight. And I think we shouldn't allow those to continue and proliferate in our society. And we need to defend people who are survivors, and we need to prevent future acts happening to individuals. That said, we need to be aware that the way that these policies are drawn up are never going to explicitly say, we want to stop the spread of journalism, or is never going to say we want to prevent leak sites from being able to do journalism based on leaks. It's going to be crafted in the way Twitter crafts it, so that they can be able to defend it if they are questioned by politicians who have to be concerned about the First Amendment or other issues related to the Constitution, since, for now, we still have it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think that's a great place to leave it. Just want to remind folks to follow us wherever you're watching. If you are not following us yet, subscribe to Kevin's newsletter. The link is right there. It's very, very good. Highly recommend it. And you can also give it shadowproof.com/donate. We have lots of donation options, membership options, perks, associated with that. We use this money to fund our journalism, coverage like Kevin's Assange coverage, or freelance journalism from any of our dozens of contributors. So if you like what we're doing at Shadowproof, see if you can support us, or tell your friends and family about us. And with that, thank you, Kevin, for all your work this week, and we will talk to you all next week. Take care.